obviously with one of the leading ex-presidents getting, which is what we all try and do when we go traveling, is you're actually, with the people, going about their day to day. Is that completely different when you're there? And I guess it's changed a lot over the years since you started your journey into exploring China and also Taiwan. Have you noticed a not just a change in the political landscape and the economy and those sorts of things, but also the people in their culture and the way they think about the world?
Yeah, I mean, it's well, to be perfectly frank, it's quite challenging in the sense that, so if I go to Australia, I can end up in a fight in 5 minutes about some issue, and then that's all fine. I can have a discussion about this, that, and the other. People are very open and free to talk. Whereas in China, the political and cultural environment is quite different. I mean, politically, it's more, there is an overarching framework, which is set by the Chinese Communist Party, and people tend to sort of discuss issues and debates within that framework, and not show sort of publicly any signs of disagreement or fractures within that overall political ideology and framework. So it does make it more challenging. Also, when I go to conferences in China, which before COVID I was doing regularly, they're more formal in the sense that people deliver their positions, they stand up, they clap, and very, very structured. Whereas a conference in New Zealand is usually a lot more raucous, people arguing, yelling things from the seats, etc. So there are those.
I need to go to your conferences. I can assure you that doesn't happen in a finance conference.
Well, maybe it should. Yeah, but when you talk to people on the streets and have friends, then depending on what the subject is, it's just normal, right? People are people wherever they are, and people will disagree whether or not that movie was good, bad, ugly. But also over the last, I would say, 5-6 years in particular, but really the last 10 years, we've seen the impact of the raised international tensions, particularly between China and the US, which makes engagement a lot harder, both within China and for Chinese people in what they would describe as the West, or particularly in the United States. And so there are some sort of residual effects of that for New Zealand academics as well.
What do they look like? Just a lack of people wanting to speak out publicly about certain things, or is it less go between China coming, people from China coming to New Zealand and the US to study and vice versa? What's the implications of that?
Well, I mean, my own experience has been that we still have a lot of engagement, which is really great, and we want to keep that as much as possible. But if you read the Chinese press and you read Chinese official statements, you'll often see New Zealand sort of lumped in with a number of countries around the world, and 5 in particular, that have increasingly tense relationships with China. And so that sort of bleeds into the types of conversations that a New Zealander would have in China. But at the same time, there's also an effort to try to distinguish New Zealand's relationship with China amongst some scholars. And I guess the other thing to point out also is, because I do political science and international relations, I mean, I'm having the conversations which are, I guess, the more sensitive ones. Whereas if you're working in a different field, for example, demographics, then I imagine it wouldn't be such a challenging issue.
When you think about how it's structured today, and I mean how it's structured compared with, say, 30 years ago, it's always been centralized decision making, but it seems to be becoming more centralized. And correct me if you see it otherwise. And the CCP is sort of, as in lockstep with its growing power as a nation, has been growing its power. Is that how you see it?
Yeah, so I guess it's useful to point out that the political system in China, it's a people's republic. So in a people's republic, you have one party that dominates, which is in this case the Chinese Communist Party, and the Chinese Communist Party is basically designed along the same lines as the old Soviet Union Party, And so it's a Leninist party. And as a Leninist party, its job is to transform society, sort of see itself as playing a vanguard role, dominate all branches of government, direct and intervene and shape economic and social outcomes. And so the very political structure is quite different to, say, in New Zealand, where the government, you have competition of parties, and you also have free, open media to criticise. And then you have the private sector, which has its own space to do its own thing. And you also have checks and balances through, for example, the judiciary or through the legislature checking the executive. That's very different in China, where power is consolidated within the political party. And the political party's job is to try to transform society. And so what's happened since, in particular since Reform and Opening, when China moved away from a really traditional model of economic development, which was based on sort of planned economy, quota systems, everybody having a job for life, heavily state-owned enterprise dominated economy, and moved towards a more market-orientated system, which allowed sort of space for the private sector to grow and also opened up to the world, is that many people predicted that would also lead to changes within the political system, where you've basically got a Leninist party system with a more open market economy, and many people predicted that that's, those two things are almost contradictions and cannot exist. And so even under Hu Jintao years or Jiang Zemin years, the Deng Xiaoping years, which were pre-Xi Jinping, people thought that was actually what was happening. There were some incremental changes, institutionalization of leadership transition, the regulatory and the legal system were being strengthened. But then under Xi Jinping, we've seen a very strong assertion that China needs to maintain and hold on to that Leninist party structure, that the Chinese Communist Party will continue to be the vanguard party, and that they will dominate and control Chinese politics.
A novice like myself, Jason, would say that that's all being done so President Xi can maintain power for the rest of his life. Is that a naive thing to look at, or is that something that the whole Communist Party wants to see because it allows them to, I guess, continue their journey, or is this an individual deciding that and a way that he can, I guess, become, some people call it the emperor of China?
Yeah, so I think it's impossible to know, to be brutally honest. I think there are elements, you can make arguments for elements of both. I mean, the Chinese Communist Party has 97 million members, and so they are a dominant social force within China, all throughout different parts of China. And so it would be, and there's a lot of benefits that come with being a party member, including access to the right people and to regulations, and so it's a very lucrative thing to have, and it comes with a lot of prestige within China. So within the political party, I think when the Soviet Union fell, and then all of the communist states within Eastern Europe fell, there was sort of a crisis mode, right? Everyone's like, is this going to happen to us? How can we avoid this happening in China? Because, of course, they wanted to maintain power. And so they studied it very, very carefully. And I think under Hu Jintao, the assessment was that the Chinese Communist Party could stay in power if it continued to have a system where the people of China became more prosperous and felt like they were a part of the international community, had all the opportunities that they wanted to live the type of life that they wanted. And so you saw more open media, lots of open travel, and allowing the private sector to flourish. And of course, that also came with high levels of corruption, and a lot of people complaining about corruption, particularly within the Chinese Communist Party. And so it seems that Xi Jinping's assessment has been instead that they need to have a very strong party, and part of having a strong party is to have crackdowns on media freedom, and to have a more focus on ideology and more focus on what they call socialist values, sort of promoting this idealized vision of what China should be. So sort of going back to this whole idea of that the role of the party is to transform society.
Recently, like last week, and James alluded to it before, there was the National Congress. Can you, it was a very important moment in China. What is it, and why was it so important? And then I guess there were some pretty important outcomes that came out of it, which I'd love to hear your take on.
Yeah, so the National Congress, it's important to remember it's a party congress, so it's the 5-yearly congress of the Chinese Communist Party. And why is it important? Yeah, sure, the New Zealand media, sometimes they focus on the National Party Congress or the Labour Party Congress or the Greens Party Congress. Will James Shaw get back in, etc., etc. But not really that important. In China, it is incredibly important because in a party state, a one-party state, what happens in the Chinese Communist Party is then transferred over into the government. So next year, when we have the National People's Congress, which is the legislature of China, the state body, all of the positions that have been determined at the Chinese Communist Party Congress will then be transferred over. So the fact that Xi Jinping stayed on for a third term as General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party, as well as Chairman of the Central Military Commission, means in all likelihood that next year, in March, when the National People's Congress comes up, he will also stay on as President or Chairman of the country, and also take the state role as chair of the Central Military Commission. So that's important in the sense that previously you used to have sort of a norm of only 2 years, 2 terms, which is 10 years at the top of the Chinese Communist Party, and then of course there were actual constitutional regulations which meant that a president couldn't sit for more than 10 years, which were changed in 2018. So obviously, this is a clear indication that Xi Jinping will stay in power, that it's a quote-unquote new era, as he likes to say. And then also, if you look at the makeup of the Standing Committee of the Politburo, which is the sort of the core center of, it's like the cabinet, small cabinet of the party, it's stacked with people who are very loyal to Xi Jinping. So you don't have the sort of the Li Keqiangs who are more sort of reform and opening minded, or other types of factions like Hu Jintao used to be part of the China Youth League faction. And so it's basically a consolidation of power around Xi Jinping. Some of the things that came out of the sort of the work reports and constitutional changes at Congress were a lot more focus on ideology, a lot more focus on security, and sort of signaling that it's a troubling international environment, and China needs to be strong. China needs to struggle, which is communist language, which can be hard for us to get our head around, but it's a common phrase in China, that it needs to struggle, and that there needs to be sort of a new development path that China needs to tread.
What's your take on the? That's the outwardly what they were sort of doing. What's your take on it in your assessment of what they were trying to, or did they achieve, and have they achieved it? Because literally, as we sit here on my Bloomberg screen, we have a story that just literally popped up, which is scary. Maybe my phone's listening to me, around the fact that is this just a way for China to turn its back on sort of the globe and go more inward looking, because in order to do that, you can take the mind off the fact that economic growth might be slowing naturally anyway, because it's been booming for the last 30 years, and it's a different way to, I guess, be a popular leader, because you're protecting the people from all these, really terrible international troubles that we're about to face. Is that a fair assessment? Because that's the Bloomberg Financial Times assessment, but I'm sure it's sort of more complex than that, and it would be interesting to see, hear how you think the journey goes from here.
Yeah, so it's contested is how I would put it. The interpretation. I mean, trying to understand Chinese politics is often like trying to read the tea leaves. It's quite hard to get a clear indication of what's really happening and what the direction of travel is. If you go back to the 50s and 60s, yeah, China was closed. It wasn't open. And it was from the 80s and 90s onwards that it opened up. And many people in China would credit that opening to the rest of the world as being the key success that China has experienced over the last 30 years that really allowed China to develop and to be part of the international community, to become a major power or a great power on the world stage. The Chinese economy is slowing for a number of different reasons, but I think some of the key reasons are that they've got an unbalanced growth model, which worked for them spectacularly. Heavily investing, manufacturing on the East Coast, using rural labor from the rural areas into those manufacturing hubs, manufacturing at really high standards, and then exporting to affluent markets overseas was a great model. But that model has run its course. They need to strengthen their consumption to rebalance and create a more sustainable growth model. Whether or not they would close in order to do that I think in the extreme, I would be incredibly surprised and really worried if that actually happened. Will they be as open and as they were in, say, the early 2000s? I doubt it. I think we're probably likely to see more of a managed type of engagement between China and the world. You can already see that in policies such as dual circulation, which is sort of talking about trying to match up the global economy with the domestic economy in order to stimulate domestic development. I guess that's where I would see it. But there are a lot of commentators overseas who are very concerned, particularly during COVID, because China's been closed for so long, that if China doesn't open up, then that could create some really long-lasting problems.
Because in one hand, you can kind of see that perhaps it's beneficial because we've had, like you said, this growth that's worked really well, and the urbanization and industrialization of the country has been a great success, not just for China, but globally, as we've imported effectively cheaper goods and cheap labor, and that can't continue anymore for a whole lot of reasons. And perhaps that's a good thing, and actually them pivoting, given it's such a mighty economy, and then pivoting to be sorting out what's going on within the country first, and then re-engaging. But maybe that's, according to these other commentators you talk about, maybe that's being overly optimistic about the intentions of what's going on.
Yeah, and I think there's a couple of other reasons around it as well, which are quite concerning. You'll be aware that over the last sort of 5 years in particular, the US-China relationship has just gone from rock bottom to new rock bottom. And we've seen a type of economic nationalism emerge in China and in the United States, which is really cutting off those types of, from a purely commercial perspective, the types of cooperation and business deals and collaborations that make perfect commercial sense are now being avoided on the basis of sort of strategic concerns or other sort of ideological concerns. So I would be surprised if China closed down completely, but I would expect to see a more managed type of engagement in the future.
I know this is probably jumping ahead a bit, Stefan, but what does that mean for New Zealand? Because that has massive implications for our biggest trading partner and how we associate with them. On the other hand, they still need to import. Thankfully, we are a primary producer of mostly food, and that is one good in the world that, in terms of thing in the world that people need, including China. So, do you think this has big effects on New Zealand's ability to do business with China and our free trade agreement, and how does that change?
Yeah, and so I think there's a few things there. So some of the fundamentals around New Zealand's, in particular, commodity exports to China are still there, and I would expect them to carry on. And so there is that opportunity, particularly in the agribusiness sector, for selling good, high-quality food into a growing market where they just don't have the amount of arable land that they would need to be able to produce the same types of high-quality products. But there, I think the question increasingly in New Zealand is more about how much is too much, sort of going back to the old days when New Zealand used to export most of its agricultural commodities to the United Kingdom, and then suddenly they said, actually, we're going to join the European Economic Community, and we went, hang on a minute, what are we going to do? And we were sort of left.
What do we do with our 65 million sheep?
yes.
Yeah.
So, and so we had to scramble. And a lot, we probably did. We had to scramble for a lot of different markets. And so there is sort of a bit of a fear, particularly when analysts look at what happened with Australia in terms of some of the sanctions that were put on certain types of Australian exports into China, like wine and barley. And so people are sort of talking about, how do you manage risk, particularly when there's a whole lot of politics in the world now. And I think it's pretty clear that where New Zealand's politics sit on a number of different international issues and issues around human rights, etc. So, potentially those types of political issues can't be avoided. So there's that side of it. And then I think there's a whole bunch of other areas which, depending on what type of New Zealand business we're talking about, but if we're talking about a high-tech business, then I think it becomes a question of if we see the US and China and things like the CHIPS Act and just this heightened security and peer competition going on where it basically means that for New Zealand high-tech companies, you choose your market, but you probably can't have both. And so there's that kind of high-tech decoupling going on in the world or bifurcation of those types of supply chain markets that I think New Zealand businesses need to get their head around.
Xi is an interesting character, sort of as a leader. I don't know a whole lot about his background, but I understand his rise to power was interesting, and it was also he has a family connection through his father to the CCP, and at one point he was quite prominent in the party. Is that what happened, and how did he get to the point that he is now, which is probably the longest serving, or definitely the longest serving leader of the state?
So, if you don't mind me advising another podcast while I'm on this podcast, The Economist did a podcast called The Prince, which basically is like 8 episodes of Xi Jinping's life. And a few of the things that you see from that was that, it's called The Prince because he is one of the quote unquote princelings. So his father, Xi Zhongxun, was one of the original revolutionaries who rose up within the party ranks, and so he was brought up in Beijing amongst the other party elites and the kids of the other party elites. But once the Cultural Revolution hit in the 1960s, and basically the Cultural Revolution was when Mao Zedong, who had been sidelined from power, decided that the youth of China needed to have that revolutionary spirit, so he created a sort of a chaos, and there were a whole bunch of teenagers called Red Guards running around criticizing people and having sort of little factional warfare, and people were denounced and people were purged. Xi Zhongxun was purged, which was Xi Jinping's father, and which meant that they were on the out, and he was eventually sent to the rural areas for re-education. And when he got back, he made a very, I think, astute political decision, which was that instead of getting involved in politics within Beijing, in the sort of central government affairs, he went out to the countrysides, and he basically was a provincial leader for a very, very long period of time, kept himself clean, and that allowed him to be both a princeling, but not a princeling that was tainted by sort of infighting amongst the Chinese Communist Party. So once he got into power, as you'll remember, everyone was thinking, this guy's going to be a major reformer. And actually what it turned out to be was that he was more of the sort of traditional ideological mold of the Chinese Communist Party, and I think we're seeing that play out today.
That's quite interesting that his father was purged, and yet he's able to, I guess, shake those that reputation on his family and then become leader. Did that almost help him go on that journey because he was able to restart his own journey, or how did that actually work? Because often your whole family is sort of marginalized if one of your family members is purged.
Yeah, so a couple of things there. A lot of people were purged in the 1960s and sort of fell out with Mao, and that was almost Mao's favorite game was to play sort of court politics and who's on the in, who's on the out. You're on the in for a while, and then suddenly you're on the out. And so when Deng Xiaoping got into power in the in the 70s and 80s, he tried to basically bring everybody back and say, because he had also been purged twice, and so he brought everybody back and said, let's stop this. This is silly. Let's institutionalize power the best that we can, and not go back to that sort of old school cultural revolution days of who's in, who's out, purging people. And so what Xi Jinping has done quite successfully, I think, is that he's sort of built this into his origin story. All good rulers or superheroes need an origin story. And particularly in a communist country where, struggling is a very important part of being of the ideology of communism, that the fact that he went down to the rural areas and had hardships and struggled through them and then prospered and came out better than before is very useful for him.
Did his time, if you will, with the people, and then was able to sort of reflect on that. Interesting.
How has he changed now that he's coming into his third term from when he first came to power to today as the leader? Obviously, will have matured into the role. But did you notice an ideological shift or a change in how he operates?
Yeah, it's quite hard to say. I mean, I think if you read the People's Daily on the day that the Congress happened, you'll see that there's an incredibly large photo of Xi Jinping on the front page. Yeah. It's excessive.
Similar to the one with Mao. Someone sent me an email with three different sort of chairman, and this one was definitely more Mao-like than anyone else since.
Yeah, so I think that sort of shows that there is this sort of centralization of power, but it's not just about the party now; it's also about Xi Jinping. So sort of he talks about being the core leadership, and also this increasing intolerance. And China was always particularly on sensitive issues like governance and politics, and has always been quite intolerant of dissent. There's this intolerance of things that are not part of the Xi Jinping worldview. And so I would say that we're seeing a lot of continuity, but that continuity is on this direction of travel where you have Xi Jinping as the core leader and people following along or having to follow along in terms of his ideological vision for where China should go.
Righto. The country is also facing headwinds on economic fronts, and which is playing into the world we operate in, financial markets and investing on behalf of our clients. What do you think are the main drivers impacting the economy at the moment there? Obviously, there's housing. The Belt and Road projects are still underway, I think, and obviously there's sort of the geopolitical tensions that are sitting across it. What do you look at when you're trying to get a sense of the drivers and that are impacting the broader economy across China, which is, as you mentioned earlier, now the second biggest in the world, having just recently pipped Japan?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things I think. So the first thing is going back to something I was talking about briefly before. If you go back to 2007, 2008, Wen Jiabao, who was the premier at the time, made a statement that shocked a lot of people where he was talking about China being unbalanced and the economic model being unsustainable. And part of that is sort of creating more domestic consumption, creating more balance between rural areas and urban areas, development balance between the east coast of China and the central and western regions of China, and moving away from this sort of export-led growth model. And if you look at Japan, Taiwan, South Korea, the other sort of East Asian dragons, when they were going through their rapid growth phase, they basically did the same things, which was to urbanize quickly, to have lots of foreign direct investment, invest in manufacturing, use their comparative advantage in terms of cheaper labor, but also incredibly strong work ethics, to industrialize, to invest heavily in construction, and to export their way to development. And that's what China's done as well. But on a far larger scale, of course, because there's 1.4 billion people in China. But what hasn't happened is China to move out of that growth model into a more sustainable, probably lower growth rate type development over the next few decades. And so that's the principal challenge that they will have to face over the next few decades. And it's a little bit unclear how they're going to do that. There's a thing called the New Development Paradigm, which I'd be watching carefully to see if there's any sort of clues about what they're going to focus on. There's also things like the dual circulation policy, which talk more about ensuring that their international trade is to support domestic trade and to promote more domestic brands, to promote moving up the value chain in terms of high-tech areas, and to promote domestic champions. And there are a few domestic champions in China already, of course. But the other challenge there is that that's come at a time, so China's not yet an advanced economy. It's still an upper middle economy, but at the same time, the deterioration of China's relations with a lot of advanced economies, not just America and increasingly Europe, but also Japan and South Korea, have really hit some problems as well, means that they are having to manage that deterioration of relations and perhaps a hesitancy to invest in the Chinese market. Some businesses within China, foreign businesses and foreign people, are concerned about the direction that the Chinese economy is going, and so they're leaving. Others are saying that they'll put their money where their mouth is and they'll ride it out, and it's the greatest long-term benefit for their companies. But there are all of these challenges. And then, of course, on top of that, sort of creating a lot of instability is the dynamic COVID zero policy, which is basically very similar, but more extreme, I would say, and very similar to the types of lockdowns that New Zealand had when COVID was first discovered in the New Zealand population, which is basically, what can we do? We can all stay home. And so you have this really strict dynamic COVID zero policy, which makes it hard for supply chains to function in the way they should, makes it hard for consumers to have confidence. And so that creates an uncertainty about how China will exit out of that strategy when particularly Xi Jinping and the government have put so much on sort of saying that they are different to countries in the West, particularly America, where they argue that they bungled COVID, and that China's not going to do that because it has such concern for its people. So there's that. And then, of course, the property market is really symptomatic of that, which is basically just over-investing and leveraging too much capital. People having mortgages for houses that are not even built yet, and trying to just keep building. And if once it stops or there's a lack of demand, then it can quite easily fall over, as you saw with Evergrande. So it will come down to whether or not local governments can find new sources of income and can sort of absorb some of that economic pain.
It's little wonder, Jason, that the Chinese yuan is at its 14-year low when you sort of set out what's going on in the economy. I wanted to touch on that COVID policy. It's on one hand, you can kind of understand at the start, as we all did, all countries around the world locked down, but there's been a lot of moving on. Even New Zealand has moved on to pretty much have no restrictions. Is it political why they're still in lockdown, or is it medical? They don't have the widespread successful vaccines perhaps as the West did, because they relied on their own and the efficacy was lower, or is this something as simple as some commentators saying is the zero COVID policy was President Xi's policy and they can't really remove it now until everybody's vaccinated, otherwise it will show it failed. Can we read too much into it, or is there some things that we can look at the COVID policy to get a hint at perhaps what's going to happen in China over the next few years?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'd love to give you a well thought out and intelligent answer. But
I'm sure anything you say will appear like that. So
it's way easier to ask these questions than answer them.
Yeah, I mean, it confuses me, I have to say. I mean, I think there's a couple of rational reasons would be that that yes, China is the second largest economy in the world, but in many ways it's still a developing country. And in particular, the healthcare system is not as strong and well developed, particularly in poorer parts of China, that it would need to be to deal with sort of a major pandemic. So when New Zealand opened the borders, you remember those months where the hospitals were under a lot of pressure. And we'd expect to see that in China, and particularly in a year of the Congress, or next year, the year of the National People's Congress, we could see that may be sort of politically unfeasible for China. I mean, there's some extreme interpretations which suggest that it's useful at this time for China to be a bit more closed. I'm not sure I sort of go with that. And then the discussions on the vaccines. I mean, the vaccines, I think from what I've read, are not quite as good as some of the other vaccines, but they're not bad. And they could work in the same way that they've worked in, say, the New Zealand case. So I think a lot of it does, as you suggest, come down to sort of staking political legitimacy on the idea that China has handled COVID better than a lot of other countries. I mean, they declared a people's war and they snuffed it out in Wuhan as it spread all around the world. And I think they're finding it hard to sort of pedal back on that. At the same time, because it was a people's war, because Xi Jinping put so much political capital into it, you're not going to have, as you did in New Zealand, a whole bunch of newspaper commentators start saying, maybe we should think about this, or maybe we should consider doing something different. The Chinese media doesn't work in the same way. The Chinese media is more like an amplifier of policies and views from the top. And so I think that does make it hard to correct. And then one does also tend to wonder when you have someone who's become the core leader, become so solidified in their power, about whether or not there are people that can, say to Xi Jinping, actually, maybe we should try something different.
Yeah, to try and, I guess, avoid the Wellington moment, but on a bigger scale in China if it continues. But it's also harder to do that because of we know what history is in history, what's happened in China, where there has been dissent. But it's this interesting case of if it is political, it's political decisions that are really hindering the economy, and with what's going on in the currency, any other sort of more shorter term economically driven country, ourselves included, would perhaps have got rid of the policy because of economics. But when you have that longer term vision, then perhaps you don't feel the need to as much.
Yeah, I mean, we're all trying to balance optimum public health outcomes with economic outcomes, and of course they're interacted. If the population are really, really sick, that's bad for the economy. But then again, if the population are healthy but they can't go to work, then that's also a problem. So I think something will have to change in China. And there was a lot of people in Shanghai and other parts of China who complained incredibly loudly for China on social media about some of the things that happened there in terms of the sort of the snap lockdowns that were going on there, and also a lot of foreign business people and foreigners who live in China that are really important for China's engagement with the global economy are increasingly just saying enough is enough. I can't do it anymore. And I think in the long term, that has really negative implications for China. I'm just not sure if the leadership are aware of that yet.
We've taken a different path in our, I guess, New Zealand, in our relationship with China compared with Australia and the tensions they've had with China over the last sort of 5 years particularly. How do you think, what are the differences in how we balance those things off? Because China's, for both countries, largest trading partner. And I'm aware that there have been times when it's actually sort of driven a wedge between the ANZAC relationship, the difference between how we interact with China. What do you make of that? And how do you think we should look at Australia?
Yeah, I think that New Zealand and Australia have approached China in pretty much the same way. If I look at the long term, New Zealand established diplomatic relations 50 years ago on the day after Australia established diplomatic relations with the PRC. And we had a free trade agreement, then Australia had a free trade agreement. And I think that if you look at the sort of the history of the relationship, there's a lot of commonality. And a lot of commonality in the types of positions that both New Zealand and Australia have taken towards China and about sort of developing the economic relationship in particular. When things sort of started to change a little bit was around 2016-17 when Australia sort of really started having diplomatic and political issues with China in a very public way. Which New Zealand didn't seem to have. And of course, then Australia was put in the freezer and didn't have those sort of high-level meetings or engagements. And of course, then Australia also had economic sanctions on a number of different industries put on. And of course, then with the previous Australian government, there was sort of high level of critical rhetoric on both sides. Both China and Australia were very, very critical of each other. And in the Australian case, they also joined the Quad, joined AUKUS, and there was sort of discussion about sort of security challenges and strategic competition with China. But actually, if you look at the types of policies that both New Zealand and Australia have taken to China, particularly in recent years, you see that they're very, very similar. And I would suggest that up until about 2017 for New Zealand, it was, so much activity and so much flurry of interest in investing and doing business and selling into China and all sorts of new types of political initiatives, from cooperation on climate change to trilateral development projects in the Pacific with China. But then after that, we've really seen a cooling of that sort of high-level political engagement on both sides. And so when you read the Chinese press, and it goes to pains to point out that New Zealand and Australia are different, I actually think there's a lot more similarity than difference. And the only, I guess, significant difference I would suggest is that in the New Zealand case, there's less of a security dimension to our discussions of China. There's plenty of human rights criticism of China in New Zealand, and also political statements, but we don't seem to have the same type of security discussions that Australia does. And so perhaps that's the thing that really pushed Australia's relationship with China over the edge.
Interesting. And so when you think about where it takes us to next, how do you see, over the next 5 years, New Zealand's relationship with China developing politically, and then also for, I guess, exporters and many of the listeners on our call have, commercial connections to China or family connections too, but in the commercial sense, how do you think that business people should look at their interactions with China?
So I think that from an economic perspective, New Zealand's economic relationship with China is on a really strong footing, and there is goodwill in both the Chinese government and the New Zealand government to maintain the type of political relationship that would allow that continuous flourishing of the economic relationship. And so that's all positive, I think. And there's a complementarity in terms of our economies, in that we buy a lot of stuff from China that we need, that they make and that we don't make, and our products are also highly valued in the Chinese market and come at a premium. But then, on the other hand, I think that the world is in a very in quite a strange moment. We're hearing a lot of rhetoric out of Chinese officials about how the world is changing, about how we need to move away from the type of international system and sort of security system that has sustained the post-war years. And how that plays out is unknown, but quite concerning, I think. And so if I was a business person, which I'm not, I'm an academic, I like sitting in my office and reading books and writing stuff, but if I was a business person, I would be not just factoring in opportunity, but I would also, whilst factoring in those opportunities which are there, I would also be considering very carefully questions of risk. And the question I would ask myself is, if I had to shift, if there was, for example, if a minor party got into the New Zealand government and then started talking about, for example, how they thought Taiwan was a real country and that it's ridiculous the way the New Zealand government talks about Taiwan or something, which would be, incredibly sensitive political issue for the Chinese government, then, it's possible that we could go the way of Australia, or what happened in South Korea when the THAAD missile defense system was deployed there by the United States, and the relationship broke down there, or with Norway when they the Nobel Committee awarded Liu Xiaobo, a well-known Chinese dissident, the Nobel Peace Prize, and then all of a sudden Norwegian salmon couldn't make it into China. I think these things need to be factored in. And then on the other side of that, as I mentioned previously, I'd also be thinking, if I wasn't an agribusiness exporter, but I was looking at other types of collaborations, I would be considering very carefully the mood and the sort of the things that have been happening in terms of the bifurcation of the tech space, particularly between the US and China, and thinking more long-term about which partners would be more valuable for the type of business that I was doing.
Well, that's a thoroughly comprehensive answer. Hey, Jason, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a really, really interesting discussion. Obviously, in your role, you get to explore what's going on there from lots of different perspectives, and we're delighted that you had, that you could share them with us, and we look forward to seeing and following your academic work over the next while, and hopefully we get a chance to speak again.
Thanks, Stephen and James.